much, everyone, for coming. And it's amazing that we've got Miranda with us tonight, especially given the life in data that she's had. And actually, I mentioned that in one of my social media posts earlier in the week. So I thought that rather than getting into the sort of the business end of the conversation, we would start with Miranda's life and what set her on this amazing path and how she got into data. So Miranda, tell us a bit about that journey.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here. It's very exciting to see real people. So thank you for coming and being real. So thank you for that question as well. And when we first talked about this, we said, how come a woman ends up in data? Because it was relatively unusual when I started. But if you'll indulge me, and frankly, you're here now and you've got your glass of wine, so you might have to. Is this a theme that I never quite fitted in? But so my parents are from Belfast, and this might be the only year that this story resonates. But in the early 70s, that was no place to bring up a family, as those of you who will have seen the film will sympathise with. And so my parents took us to Holland, where I went to nursery school. So when we returned to England, and this is what a Northern Irish accent looks like for somebody who went to school in England when the IRA were around, because everybody thought that my dad was in the IRA. So you drop your Irish accent the minute you can. But if Louise was here, I'd be lilting gently into it. Anyway, there I am at nursery school in England, having never been taught in English, never written or done any reading in English, but done quite a few numbers. So from the beginning, I was the child that did numbers, and then when I went to an all-girls school, and I'm quite grateful I did, because I found it a very nurturing environment. And then I remember very clearly a time in my sixth form when I said to my mum, I'm really glad I'm not in a mixed environment, because I don't think I'd be comfortable being the best at physics in a maths class, in a boys' school, in a mixed school. The look of horror on her face, like she'd failed to bring up a balanced child, was terrible. But I think there's a lesson in there. If you're confident in yourself, then you're quite happy with that being your strength. But if you've always had to battle some form of internal dialogue that you shouldn't be the best at physics, then it's hard. But anyway, so believe me, I'm not going to do my whole life, because that would be very, very boring. But after a while, I worked at Royal Mail, and I had a great time there. And I'd been there about 10 years, and I'd had a couple of periods of maternity leave. And I was just coming back from the second period of maternity leave. And I'd had an unusually broad career, my career coach told me to say. So I'd argued with striking postmen at midnight. I'd been the only shift manager in the building, and I'd had that happy experience. I'd spoken to a client, I'd sold some stuff. And I had prepared the chief executive for select committee, which was another rich experience. So I sort of didn't belong to anybody. I wasn't in anybody's tribe, so nobody really wanted me. But everybody felt they had part of me. And this vacancy came up running the data business. And I'd just done some work planning what the operations infrastructure should look like in London. And London had the worst quality of service of mail anyway, always did. And I'd always, there were sort of reasons why that was, heavily unionised workforce, the volume was enormous, the traffic was difficult, but nobody really ever got to the answer. I was working for this delightfully indulgent boss, and we'd just got this new regulator, so there was much more data around than there'd been before, and I'd got hold of this massive spreadsheet. And I was just trying to understand why London was different. And so I plotted on this small graph, it felt like a big graph at the time, all the delivery offices. So that's where you go and collect your parcels when they can't get it through your door. I plotted along there the average mail receipt per delivery point in all the delivery offices all over the country. And there was a fairly standard distribution. And then there were, at the far end, right at the top end, was this massive, massive spike where all the London delivery offices were. I was like, well, we're trying to do, we've designed a model that fits the bell curve, and we're surprised it doesn't work for the extremities. And they said, yeah, off you go to the data business, dear. And that's when I started. And I thought the ODI, I believe, was before 2012.
No.
Well, I know you'll be right.
The discussions about an ODI started quite a long time before that, actually under the new Labour government in around about 2009.
Okay, so when was the Gordon Brown election?
So that was Gordon Brown lost the 2010 election.
Right.
Yeah, so that was...
So when I was managing PAF, I felt like I was under attack from the ODI, but maybe I'm just dreaming of that. So I was selling postcodes, and we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But I was selling postcodes, and that was interesting because I thought this was a really interesting data set. It's not complex. It's a routing instruction. So if you think about your postcode, what's our postcode here? EC something. EC is
N1. We're in N1 okay. Actually. We're in these
so N. The first letter bit is the mail centre from which it is posted, and then 1 is the delivery office area. N is the mail centre area. 1 is then the delivery office. Mm-hmm. So that's the place where you go and get your parcel when they can't deliver it. And then there's the first bit after the space is another number which further brings it down, and then the last 2 letters are which never have the letters of SICMOV in it. We might never get to the second question.
I know, but anyway, carry on. I'm loving it.
And that's all a routing instruction, and they're all very natural units,
right?
Because if you're sending somebody out to deliver mail, if they're on a bike, you need to have all the addresses that can be reached on a bike in the same unit, because that makes sense. And if you're sending somebody in a van, it doesn't make sense to send them to high-rise buildings. So they're very natural units, and a lot of people thought it should be free. Very, very useful. Google were really annoyed by it, but somehow you had to. It was very important to keep it going because more and more people have become used to it. And then I went and worked at Ordnance Survey. Same argument was going on, and that's really. Can I tell you another postcode story? I'm full of postcode stories.
You can, because I'm really sorry. I have trailed ahead to this as well. I'm really interested in these light bulb moments and the outliers in the sort of to the bell curve, and the sort of the strange and surprising and sometimes delightful things that data tells us that we're not necessarily expecting. And, by all means, move on and tell another Royal Mail story, but I don't want to lose some of those great tales about the times when you've been surprised by the data that you've worked with. So
the brilliant Caroline Bellamy, who is the CDO at now the MOD, so I just said everybody she's Q, she says that, and she's much more technical than I am. She says that to study data is to understand the story of its collection and its use, and only sort of by understanding that story and understanding the foibles of it and its weaknesses can you really do good work with it. When I was at OS, we were doing some work trying to understand the nature of a village. And so something like Soho, there's a lot of evidence that people can draw it on a map, can draw the boundaries, and they mostly agree, but there aren't so many formal boundaries. We were looking at this village in somewhere near Portsmouth, and we were looking for the village name in the address so that we could try and draw the boundary around it. And we found that all the areas with the village in the address were non-contiguous. So there'd be a lump of houses here with the village in the address, and the bit in the middle wouldn't have it. And when I was talking to the guys that were doing it, I said, well, clearly what happened is this, because it was postal addresses. So clearly what's happened is that these postmen put the name in, and these didn't. So it's a real. We think that data is a machine thing, and it's got human stories deeply embedded within it. And my other favourite one is we did some really detailed mapping of Manchester to support a smart city pilot. And one of the things we mapped was lampposts, because previously Ordnance Survey maps everything that's higher than 30 centimetres, because when Ordnance Survey was founded late in the 1700s, they were mapping the south coast because they were worried about the French invading. So you mapped everything that's higher than 30 centimetres because a man could lie behind and shoot. So they didn't map lampposts, and still don't. So for this study we did. One of the ways we cut the data was to look at the height of lampposts. And what we discovered is that the very highest, tallest lampposts go on the very majorist roads, and then they get progressively shorter. So in fact, you almost didn't need to map the lampposts or the roads, because by knowing the height of the lamppost, you knew the classification of the road. I think those which came first?
Exactly. I mean, Ordnance Survey is a fascinating example, and a lot of your career has been spent in geospatial data, but also in organisations that have that kind of tension between, they see their data as kind of intellectual property, as a sort of commodity that can be monetised, and there's a kind of tension, right, between the idea of those assets as assets that are intrinsically for the public good being held in organisations which have to wash their faces, to be really honest. I wonder how you navigated that and where you sit in terms of the sort of the data spectrum, as we call it at the ODI, the sort of, the kind of open, shared and closed data. How do you think about all of that, rationalise all of that?
So like I said, I felt like I was under attack. Because all the economic analysis says that geospatial data is unparalleled in the economic value it can deliver. So fine, and that is unarguable. And that the reason it is because it's a great interlocutor. Because if you relate things to geospatial, you can put them on a map, and then people who need data for different reasons can interrelate it through the medium of place. Now, this has two problems. First of all, the geospatial people, and I always felt really embarrassed being called a geospatial person because I hated geography. It was the first subject I gave up. It's embarrassing on so many levels. And so people who work in geospatial tend to believe that putting it on a map is the answer to everything, but it's not going to solve your problems like the data of the Grenfell fire. That doesn't give you supply line of sight if you've got a dangerous batch of things. Which flat box of flats should I empty or evacuate? It's more than making maps. It's the interlocutor region of it, and I absolutely think that both Royal Mail and Ordnance Survey have peculiar international assets which could give the UK economy a great head start. As it happens, I also think Company House is one of those. We have these sort of bits of data infrastructure which are unrivaled. So I think I'm consistent with the ODI point on that, but my nuance is different. And so based on that logic point, some people think that therefore it should be free and widely available. And I think you've missed out a couple of points there. If we've got this thing, we need to make it economically sustainable. And giving it away free, all the evidence is that the people who benefit from that transaction, that change in terms of reference, are the people who can consume it at scale. And they're all based on the West Coast and don't pay UK tax. I think that's wrong. But because OS and Royal Mail were both sort of forced into this thing, which we think you should give your data away for free, and they heard that as, we want to ruin your business, you're in a fight for survival for your organisation. It got quite angsty. Whereas really we should have been having a much more mature debate about what is the best way to sustain data infrastructure for the UK. And when I talk about data infrastructure, I don't talk about broadband, which is another thing that irritates me.
Neither do we.
I know you don't.
So I mean, I suppose what you're saying is that some of those cultural drivers have caused, that slightly monopolistic, definitely hoarding, or kind of keeping
Gollum, isn't it?
Gollum, my pretty, keeping the goodness inside the organisations, which potentially, I guess means that because the lack of willingness to share or the fear of sharing.
I think you're wrong. I think that's a really ODI way of saying it.
Is it? Okay.
You don't share it. They do. They just don't have very well developed commercial models.
Okay, that's
so
fair enough.
If the only spectrum you have is the ODI spectrum, which is extremely good, but it's insufficiently sophisticated. So you've got the data golems who are like, my data's really valuable, you can't have it. And at the other end, you've got people, my data's a bit rubbish. And if you say, well, give it away for free, they're like, brilliant, I'm going to publish and forget my rubbish spreadsheet, and then I don't need to worry about it. And then if I build a really important business, which, for example, supports an element of the NHS based on open data, that might be a good thing. But then at the moment when I change the way I gather my fairly shambolic spreadsheet and some bits of care provision fall over, that's not handy. Open data doesn't give you security of supply, doesn't allow you to engage in a debate about what data you need to solve your problems. I think plague on everybody's houses. We need to be much more mature in the way in which we transact data, and I'm really excited that we are beginning to see it. But it isn't a one-way spectrum.
When we spoke earlier in the week, So I'm kind of moving, I'm going to jump a couple of questions, but then come back again. Yeah, you can, can't you? So we talked about, I used another metaphor, which was like, if we're kind of on that, if the mountain of maturity is Kilimanjaro, where are we at the base camp yet? How far up the mountain are we? In terms of our maturity and thinking about these concepts and ideas and actually beginning to derive value from them. I think that's the key thing.
How good are we at deriving value from data?
Well, you were talking about, being a bit more sophisticated, not think that the ODI's spectrum is a bit too simple and we need to, it's absolutely fine.
I quote it all the time. I think it's marvellous.
But it's also quite old. It's quite a long time since we developed that. And it probably, does need to be revisited and tweaked for 2022. I suppose in a way I'm trying to get some free consultancy.
Well, yeah, delighted. Nothing would give me greater pleasure. So how good are how
far are we to this to really seeing the value from businesses like Ordnance Survey?
Oh, don't tempt me on that. So I think we now understand how tall the mountain is.
Okay.
So another thing that really annoys me. I've sounded like I'm angry. I've emerged from my kitchen after 2 years. I've turned into this angry woman. But people talk about how brilliant Citymapper is, and Citymapper is fantastic. I used it to get here. I use it all the time. But I went to meet Move It in Tel Aviv. That's who met to Move It, who are considerably better. And the nice man said to me, not fat and lazy as a result of TfL's open APIs. Because they use mobile phone data, so they don't even need to know where the bus stops are, which is fine if you're in London, but rubbish if you're in Liverpool. So that's what it is. But what really annoys me is that Citymapper have produced this excellent service, but then think they're in a position to sell data back to TfL. Because they have, they've added value to the data set, and they now know much more about the flow of people around London than TfL ever can. But that is an immaturity of business model. We should have, we the public, we TfL should have said, if you ever derive value out of this, can we have it for free? You can sell it to everyone else you like, but using us as the customer base isn't right. So I think we're having much more grown-up discussions about what should happen. I think it's easy to get sucked down wormholes where we talk about, is my data worth gazillion pounds or 2 gazillion pounds? Yeah. And I don't think that really solves any answers, any really difficult questions. I'm excited that there are people trying to climb the mountain and saying, how might we find economically sustainable ways to share data and to create joint value? And that doesn't mean you have to give it away for free. I think we're getting there, but we're not going to get there in one great leap.
Are there any examples of organisations or businesses that are doing better than others?
Oh, I'm sure there are, and I'm sure your colleagues in the room will tell us how there are. There are some. So the ones I know, and I'm really up for hearing better ones. So National Highways have done some excellent work where they have ranked their data assets so that they can have much better discussions about which ones require investment, so that they can start to put investment in their data assets in the way they will their physical assets. I think there are some interesting, the law firms tell me that there are, and I can't use the word cartel, but it's the only one I can pick out in my head at the moment, there are some groups of people who, there are groups of people who work together. So if you're issuing credit cards and you get a new applicant and you want to do your risk scoring on that applicant, you can submit the name of the applicant into a magic data machine, which allows you to check the parameters you would use for your risk scoring that they've already gathered. So they're collaborating through data, and they've been quite careful about not being anti-competitive and not owning each other's data and not using each other, but they're doing it for public good. Now I'm on the theme. And NUAR is a very good one, the National Underground Asset Register, where the utilities are sharing data properly, so that fewer people can die when they go to work. And then London are using that very successfully, so they don't, so that they can coordinate streetworks. And the reason I think NUAR stands it's a Cabinet Office project. The reason I think that NUAR stands a great chance of success is you don't want to be the idiot that didn't share their data, and then somebody came across as a result. So we're going to get up this mountain by finding the examples of places where we can set things to zero, and sharing for the purposes of safety. You have to. You can't. You can't not do that in theory. Though I think Darren would disagree. But I'll stop there.
We talked a little bit last time about some of the kind of ways that you incentivize good data sharing, and I suppose you could broadly describe that part of our conversation as, the carrot versus the stick, right? And I at the time I asked you about, is there any way that we can kind of mandate certain practices, regulatory or legal instruments to persuade organisations, nay, force them to do the right thing? You had a really interesting reaction to that, and kind of you said, well, don't be ridiculous. I don't know how you do that. So I think the audience would really love to hear that, because it's this whole notion that you can only achieve kind of, I suppose, radical change in terms of the ways that data is shared or opened, if you kind of have some sort of instrument to force people or dramatically encourage people to do it.
Yeah. Yes. And but I think so. Did I say? I better remember what I said. I said, "Don't be ridiculous." That's no way that can happen. You can't force it.
Yes. Yeah. Pretty much.
Yes.
And then you said, "Oh, I can't say that." I said, "Yeah, you can. You can say that."
Well, because I think so people will hide data, will have different contractual structures and things, and that was always my concern with sharing infrastructure data. If you mandate people to open it, and as we've discovered, if you mandate people to share data, they were like, "Oh yes, absolutely, we should do that. It's really important." But our cybersecurity people don't let us, and the GDPR people can't possibly allow that, and the commercially liability that just and so if you mandate them, there will be, and the contractor owns it, so I don't have it. But if you start to say, but if you shared data, think of the way that your supply chain could work much more effectively. Think of the people that would no longer get harmed at work. Think of the greater productivity and efficiency. And right, suddenly I can find it. Suddenly I'm applying my marginal effort, and it's going to happen. So I'm very much more carrot than stick, which is why I think it's really important to solve the problem. And I see it often, of the people who are going to need to invest in making data useful to somebody else have to be able to make a return. So we've just finished some work here, actually, with the HSE, where we're trying to get people who do design risk registers for construction site share their risk data so that everybody can have much better risk register data. I got the S in the wrong place. So that fewer people come to harm at work. But we're asking the design people to invest so that the construction people make more money. And you don't need to be anybody's business genius to work out that that's probably not going to work. So and who fixes that hole, who ties back, who lashes back that economic lever, it might well end up being a regulator with some form of mandate, but they have to come at it from that angle rather than a piece of legislation that says you will share all your data, because you'll end up in that Royal Mail sort of ordnance survey debate, like, you're threatening my business. I'm not going to do it. I'll find a way of not doing it. And you need to lead people towards it.
And do you think that just the reaction that you've just described, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to resist it, and therefore the data has no utility? It's not that it has no utility, but it doesn't have all of the utility that it potentially could. Does that get in the way of innovation? Does that get in the way of, either innovation, new commercial models, broader societal benefits? Is that the risk?
Is the mandate? Is the other question you're asking? Is the mandate?
So the fact that what you said was you don't think that you can force people to share data, and therefore they kind of hoard it, they hang on to it, and so all that potential stays locked away.
And so the risk. So I see the risk. We've all worked in organisations where, I've got my spreadsheet and you've got your spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And when it comes to an argument, we argue about whose spreadsheet's better, rather than both investing in a system which produces the data that we can then agree that is the customer experience, or that is the production flow line. And then we're arguing about whether or not I had the bits in the right place and whether your people were doing the right job, rather than spending useless time about our competing spreadsheets. So I do, and I worry that's a hidden cost. So people who are warring about their different spreadsheets are wasting money that the organisation can't see. So when you say I'm going to fix that problem, everybody goes, well, there's no problem there. What are you doing? So that's, I worry that potential is lost, and I worry that argument is very hard to make, which is why I think this is the question you're actually asking me. Remember now.
Do you want what?
No. I think I'm going to do that. Go on. So because this is a complex problem, and I think it's a people problem much more than because we haven't really talked about distributed architectures or anything fun like that, is because it's because it's not deeply technical enough for the deeply technical people to get really excited about it, and it's nobody's going to be famous for solving a problem that nobody likes to admit they have. Certainly not in financial circles. We're reliant upon enthusiasts who get this stuff. Rather than well-funded, super-duper high-profile programs. And, we might think that that's real shame, but all the evidence about innovation is that, all the best forms of innovation come from a really grotty corner of a campus somewhere where nobody funded properly. And only then does something go through sufficient iterations to make it sustainable.
Do you think part of the reason for that is that it's just a thought that's just occurred to me, and you might completely disagree with it, but I was just thinking about trust. And in the sort of grotty corner of the campus, trust is perhaps not such an issue. The stakes maybe aren't so high. I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot we talk more about the human aspects of, how we transact and how we operate around data than we do about the technology. And that's kind of, in a way, why the ODI is here. But, trust between human beings is so fundamental to all of this. And I wonder, whether you have any thoughts about the mechanisms that we as society and as businesses can deploy to improve those levels of trust and understanding.
That's a big question, isn't it?
It's a very big question.
So I'll go back to my...
how long have we got? Until midnight?
Yeah, well, perfect. I think these people want wine before then.
We'll give them a drop to sustain them, then carry on.
I'm ready to stop talking. Because I want more wine. I think the competing spreadsheet thing is indicative. If you don't trust someone, you're not going to buy their spreadsheet. So if you do trust them, you'll collaborate on a common spreadsheet so that you can then have a substantive discussion about what's going on. And if you trust someone, you will build a relationship so that you share your data, so that you understand the story in your data. And we it is so important when we're getting through these commercial models and revealing, because nobody, there's, for every golem there's somebody saying I can't possibly share my data. It is terrible. It's full of holes. The machine breaks down every Wednesday afternoon, and we always miss this thing. And by revealing the stories of our data, then we will understand the frailties in our decision making processes, and only then will we get to economic glory. I believe. Have I answered that?
That's a great vision, and I was thinking it's a great place to end on and ask the floor if they have any questions, because my goodness, we've kind of been on a bit of a journey all the way to Kilimanjaro and back via Belfast. Yeah. Thank you, Miranda. Questions?
Hello. Okay. Hi, Josh at the ODI. Question to you about sort of business models and public goods. So your example of sort of TfL, open data, and City Mapper, and how the sort of Tel Aviv counterpart may have created a better model. Do you think that the sort of tension or counterbalance between data around public services potentially being a public good and therefore should be open is a stronger argument than if it's about public services and is not a public good and therefore should have a sort of business model around it that might charge for it?
What do you think?
I think it's a public good.
See, I think so. Have you ever? There's a great podcast which my husband's a great fan of, which is Why Is Everything So Shit? It's John Richardson, which have you listened to it?
I've heard of it. I've had it recommended.
It's deeply depressing. And the sort of the theory of that, the underlying theme of that is the marketization of public goods undermines society. So, if you incentivize gas to be delivered on lowest consumer price or water to be delivered on lowest consumer price, you don't invest in the resilience of the system to deliver the most economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable water and gas system. You give all the value to consumers who buy more broadband or whatever. And we have a whole generation of civil servants who believe that the market is the answer to everything. Which way am I arguing this? So I think and I don't. I think there are public goods which need to be safeguarded, and I think we can probably agree at that level. And then where we draw the boundary around what a public good is difficult. I just think we need to be more imaginative in how we find economic models to sustain our public good. And I passionately believe that we've got to start talking about our data infrastructure, because so many problems are a failure of interoperability. So we can't send tanks to Ukraine, or we can't send aeroplanes. We can't send something to Ukraine because we work on a completely different communication system, which is a data interoperability problem. And we've got such a brilliant data infrastructure here that we should be investing in it properly. And I don't mean over-investing in it. I don't mean making it make more money. I mean investing in it for the long term. And I think we lack the economic models to think about that. Good question.
Thank you for a very interesting talk so far. On the last question, surely perhaps the balance to be drawn is, where do you decide how much of the data value remains with the vendor and how much goes? It's not so much all or nothing. But what I really wanted to ask you was, you mentioned Companies House as a repository of data, but frankly, Companies House data is rubbish. This is well known, and the government have finally decided to do something about it. I'm just curious why you mentioned them.
So I thank you. I'm exposed. I don't know enough about it. So thank you. I agree with you on the question of balance and who keeps what money. And I think what data is giving us is a degree of sophistication we haven't had before. It's the identifier within Companies House could be used to much greater effect, is what I'm thinking.
Actually, just wanted to comment on that Companies House thing, because you said the identifier could be used better. Well, one of the things is that they don't actually, there's an international standard for identifying entities, the legal entity identifier, LEI, which is an ISO standard, and they don't support it at all. It's not even in their data set. So basically, they have a proprietary identifier, which is just for the UK. But if you want to actually use the LEI, which is an international system issued by a number of different people, including my company actually, but that's an open standard, truly, but it's not supported by Companies House.
Well, I thank you. I bow to your knowledge. I met when I first met Nigel Shadbolt. He said, "Wouldn't it be brilliant if everybody just used Companies House data?" There's no answer to which there's no question to which the answer is not better joined up government. So if everybody just used the Companies House data to talk about entities, then we'd have more efficient government. But I bow to everybody else's superior knowledge on that. Believe me.
Name is Nigel Hickson. I'm a civil servant, which I don't necessarily apologise for, but. In terms of what you said about locked data in companies and institutions that don't really realise that the data that they have could be useful for their own supply chains or their own businesses, let alone a public good. How do you reach them? How do you? I mean, it's London's sophisticated TfL. I'm sure that there's a lot of small companies that are in the mix, if you like. But if you go into the manufacturing sectors and the sectors that are less, if you like, aware of some of the data potential, then I just wonder how you reach this data. Thanks.
So I spend a lot of time with people who say, I've got this brilliant idea about this technology we can use to get this data to be available. And I say, that's fantastic. What's the use case? And data that doesn't create value. Well, so when I'm talking about digital twins, a digital twin that doesn't create value is not a digital twin. So if you've worked out the problem you can solve and the data you can use to fix it, the journey will force you to change the data in some way, unless you're very lucky, and the problem will get progressively better solved. Which is why I think back to the point, you can't mandate people to share it. You need to expose them to the idea that if they did share it, the world would somehow be a better place.
So it's the point about use case set cases again, and proving ROI, proving the value, which is really hard to do. And a lot of individuals and organisations, including the ODI, since 2012, have been working not continuously, but sporadically, but fairly regularly on, running experiments, doing research, working with other organisations, trying to, find new models for demonstrating the value in data. And there is an argument which says that, you have to put data on the balance sheet, right? You have to somehow make organisations accountable for it in the same way that they're accountable for their financial affairs, in order to be able to really see its value and for it to be exposed to the disinfectant of sunlight, to coin a David Cameron phrase.
I thought it was a bit Donald Trump. That's something else, isn't it? But so yes, but no, but. So there's a really good SME called Animate, which is run by a man who's worked in consultancy for a number of years, and he's worked with National Highways, which is how I know about them. And they say before we get it on the balance sheet, we'll all be long retired by the time it's on the balance sheet. And by then, what's the point? You're much better off working out which data creates value for your organisation, and you treat it like a proper asset, rather than working out the accountancy practices that will be required to put it on the balance sheet. And that interesting piece of work we're going to do here soon, are we allowed to talk about it? Where we're going to try and make sense of the ESG data landscape. Because at the moment it's measure whatever you like, report against whatever you like, and good luck. And I was going to say, on your point about the excellent work, I'm a huge fan of the ODI Data Institutions work. I'm sure, like me, you were all glued to the event last week, and I think the recordings are available on the ODI website.
If not yet, then they're there.
Oh,
they're
look at
there.
this.
They're
I'm
on.
actually a free
Yay.
advert. And I've followed them with a great deal of interest. But I think they've been focused on the glory of sharing data
Yeah.
rather than making economically sustainable cases. That means that the gubbins and the machinery of a data institution can be sustainably funded going forward, so that people are going to make a return and keep doing it. So that's where I'm excited about where it's going next, which may be a question you tried to ask me earlier and I failed that answer. Sorry, you had a question and I rattled on.
I mean, all this about data sharing is not new, except my generation didn't have computers like they have now. But I think it's also should be taught at school how important it is to share, work together, than rather, everybody do their own thing and then the arguing starts and you don't get anywhere. It's also politics at work, and I think a good management will encourage their staff actually how productive it is, and not everybody wants to show how I'm good at it. And I think it should be a subject in secondary school, teaching students about the importance of being productive in sharing and working together.
Completely agree.
I mean, that may be very basic, but I'm looking from the human side.
I met an engineering professor last week, and she was saying, the employers are all saying, I want people who can share, I want people who can collaborate, I want people to work cross-functionally, I want them to work in teams. And she said, I absolutely agree, and I want to make my graduates employable. The problem is I also have to teach them some calculus. And the demands on students are becoming so many and various that it
is interesting. I mean, obviously the ODI is very concerned about data literacy, but we think about it in a slightly different way to many. I mean, we are a training organisation as well, but we think about it in a slightly different way, which is, that we have to think critically about data. I mean, I made an observation. I've got 2 teenage children, and they still critique literary texts in the same way that I did when I was at school eons ago. But they haven't been given the same, or they're not being taught the same critical thinking around data and about the stories that they're being told using data. And to me, that is a real gap in the curriculum. I mean, obviously, yes, they can do computer studies and they do maths and they do physics. But when it comes to actually being critical about the data that they're seeing and the stories that are being told with it, they're not getting that.
Some of the most interesting use of data that I've encountered, at least, is published in academic studies, such as, there was a recent economics paper that was looking at company formation using whatever the Danish equivalent of Companies House is, not to harp on that again, or, for example, French building planning submissions, and ways that buildings are configured in France, and sort of doing analyses against various local economic factors. And I guess one of my questions is the fact that there are such novel data approaches and novel uses of these data sets coming out of academia. Doesn't that suggest that there's a little bit of a disconnect? I mean, we came into this discussion with the prospect of discussing new business models for data. The fact that it's a bunch of academics who are actually gleaning any kind of value out of this data suggests to me that maybe there isn't that much commercial value in what's not yet. That, essentially all the really valuable stuff has already been plumbed by either hedge funds or Bloomberg or large businesses, and everything else is just sort of, this completely balkanized, map of you have this really interesting data set for a few buildings in North London. Who cares? There has to be some value in the gap there. And I guess this is a little bit of a meandering question, but I guess the point is, if you're really seeing some of the more interesting uses of data coming out of academia and not out of industry, maybe that suggests that there isn't that much money in a lot of this.
You could well be right. I love the phrase the balkanized desert of data, and I think you're right. But I also think hedge funds are lazy. They go for the sugar syrup, and they're not very good at making sugar syrup out of lentils. You know, they're going to go where it's easiest to make money, and maybe the returns aren't huge from sharing information about infrastructure for the built environment or saving people's lives, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing.
We do have very valuable businesses which use other people's data, Google, Facebook, and all the rest of them. So that shows there is some value which many people using Facebook, say, are basically giving it away almost for free. I have seen it suggested that models of people securing the data and actually transacting that data trusted in return for something. Now, ODI, I always thought the open included a reference to transparency and not just to here it is for free. But I'm guessing that you would be quite happy if people sold their data. Yes is the short answer to that, because I say there's a difference between free speech and free beer. One is a universal public good, and one maybe not, though initially attractive. And so transparency, yes, but it goes back to the point about making data assets, and particular data assets that improve interoperability, making them as good as they possibly can be. Because I don't think the best economic good is done by giving away a cheap version of, for example, geographic data. I think, and then getting people to augment it separately in different places. I think if we invest in a good, solid infrastructure core, which is somehow made economically sustainable, we will do more economic good. And which is why I was really excited by the Mydex presentation last week, which has got a really cool use case. So for those of you who weren't here, if you are unlucky enough to be diagnosed with cancer tomorrow, you'll fill in 1 million forms and deal with a gazillion people who basically need the same information from you. And somehow, you just spend a lot of time applying for a blue badge and disability living allowance and keeping the doctor up to date and then meeting some different nurse and things. Can I not have a personal data store that eases this burden from me? And that I thought was fantastic. And also that's also solving a problem that nobody likes to admit they have. Yeah. And so again, it's really difficult to make the ROI. Yeah. And there are those sort of personal data trusts or those tool, and think about how little you can be bothered clicking the Wi-Fi transaction details. And then, do you want my data for this? Do you want it for that? Can I not have a thing that says I'm about to go online? Here are my rules. That's, I think, the nirvana we can all agree with. Yeah. And I don't mind paying £3 a month for Facebook or something. If you just don't mess about with my data and sell it to some dodgy people. But because we all believe all that stuff is free, that's going to be quite a hard argument to make.
Yeah. So that's a massive societal shift, actually, at scale. Any other questions?
Hello. Just on this question of organisations adding value to open data and then trying to sell it back to the source, I thought with open source code, there were licenses where you could license it, and then if it was modified, it would have to be relicensed under the same terms. So in terms of it being open, so why can't that be applied? Are you aware of that, and why can't that be applied to data?
I feel that I'm going to be much less aware than you. So I am aware that the models for shared ownership of code are much more sophisticated than they are for data. And I would ask the same question. Why can't we do that kind of thing? But I would need you to explain to me precisely what I'm talking about, I think.
Hello. I think it's very similar with the previous question. I'm thinking about the use of decentralized ledger technologies. You've been mentioning trust. You've been mentioning data in silos. Sorry. So, what's going on that side for you? Is there any advance that you can discuss with us, or is there any project that you're aware of that could be game changers?
Well, I think everybody believes they're going to be game changers, which is a good thing. So the National Digital Twin Programme is continuing, and they're trying really hard. We are trying really hard. But they're hamstrung by, you've got to do an awful lot of plumbing and spend a lot of money before you get value. And then the person that got the values didn't spend the money. So it sort of gets a bit stuck. I was at a fascinating event last week, about the digital twin of the ocean, which is you think about what you can measure in the ocean and what you need to know, like what's the plankton concentration in the ocean and where the currents go, and what's the temperature of the ocean. How on earth do you measure that, and how do you present the data? I'm very excited when I see people who've got use cases and are then trying to break those silos piece by piece. I'm even more excited if they're going to then be able to apply those lessons as widely as they possibly can. So which is why I think it's really good to keep an eye on NUAR, the Underground Asset Register, because that is going to have to be there's going to have to be a commercial transaction in that somewhere, and it's quite short. So I give you my data on where my gas pipes are. You tell me where your electricity pipes are, so that we don't damage each other's assets. That's not. You don't need to be as clever as some of those people are. But we've got to work really hard to capture that learning.
Well, I've got a business, and we started it, and there was a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt, and it was all about open source versus proprietary and all of that sort of stuff. So it's not really open versus closed. That needs to change. It's a big thing, I think, is the trust and the currency of the data. And that's where things can be monetized, especially in the economy. So if you wanted the better good for UK PLC, you could say to the Ordnance Survey, and I work in mapping and different things, but you've got to publish master map. You do it once a year. Anyone can use it, play with it, do what they need to do with it. I know they have their own licensing for doing that stuff. But if you want to go to a new thing they've got, which are a set of web services that may have a cost for that organisation, well, maybe the transaction model that they have would work, because people want currency. Like a business wants the currency. They don't want 12 months old data. And if you take NUAR, they want to know that actually it was checked yesterday. Is it still available? Is that street? So there isn't a big enough debate, I think, because this was about sharing data of the options that are available. It's not just, and the other side is companies who are successful, whatever we say about Google and people like that, generate taxes, and that's how this economy is built for government. The example, and this is my final bit on this, is if you go to Amazon, and you put in your address, I'm pretty sure they don't use PAF. They've done that many transactions and deliveries, they've got a map of the country. And people have said, this is my postcode, and when they go and deliver it, they know where that is. So the stuff with the West Coast is going to happen of the state. So to try and, I think there hasn't been a big enough debate about all of that, which is why we're here, I guess.
So I want to come back to you on two things. So when I sold PAF, when I sold OS data to Amazon, they could not believe how little I was selling it to them. And I had to sell them at a rate because of the Information Fair Trade Scheme. So I had to charge Amazon the same as I charged Middle Wallop Parish Council, and they said, I'm trying to remember if I'm allowed to say this. They said they had seen more improvement in their delivery performance in 10 months than they normally saw in 10 years because of the accuracy of OS data versus anything else globally. And then they said it's not accurate enough, which is why they're a global dominant company. The bigger one that doesn't use any form of OS data is Uber, because they really are mapping exactly what they need. Yeah, yes, absolutely.
They're right on the back of Google.
And you will know more than me.
Well, I don't actually know that, but I'm just presuming it, because they use the Google Map stuff inside. But the Amazon one, I'd wonder now about the copyright that was on PAF licensing, whether they would have adhered to that or not. But I don't want to go into that debate.
None of us have to worry about that. And your point on NUAR, the thing that I think is really important that we crack is, if I dig a hole and I find your pipe, and I find your pipe in poor condition, we need to incentivize the relaying of that information. Because at the moment there's no incentives because we don't value the data. If I find your pipe and it's nearly broken, I say, well, how about when I'm here, I fix it? None of those incentivization mechanisms work. But happily, the GLA have just done some excellent work. I can't wait to hear about it. About the incentivization of and regulation of data sources when they're digging up streets. So that's coming, which is going to be even more exciting than the new one. Yeah.
Okay, I think we probably need to
Exhausted
wrap
the
up, and I
audience,
think Miranda probably deserves a drink. Thank you to Miranda, and thank you to all of you.